Every year since 2015, 70 plus people join the Giving Circle to come together and to address critical needs facing the Black community. Their commitment and generosity is why we are here today. Thank you to all who support the Black Giving Circle Fund. Happy 5th year anniversary. Tonight, you will hear from my fellow Howard University alumni, Jelani Cobb, Valeta Fullwood, and Connecticut's own Leah Wright-Rigar. You are here for a treat, but first, I would like to introduce the president of the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, Jay Williams. Jay leads this organization with zest and an eye to move the foundation's work forward for the community's benefit. He has been a huge supporter of the Black Giving Circle and its members since his day one. It is a pleasure to welcome none other than Mr. Jay Williams.
Good evening. Shari, thank you for not just the introduction, but for your leadership of the Black Giving Circle Fund. That certainly predates my arrival. From my earliest days at the Hartford Foundation, you have been a force to be reckoned with. Your passion, your intellect, your professionalism, and your creativity in leading the Black Giving Circle Fund, amongst the other things that you do at the Hartford Foundation, are greatly appreciated. And I do echo Shari's sentiments in wishing the Black Giving Circle Fund a happy 5th anniversary. This is a part of a series that we are exceptionally excited about to be hosting and part of. And I really just want to express that the Hartford Foundation, which is the largest foundation in the state of Connecticut, one of the oldest and largest in the country, serves 29 communities in the greater Hartford region, Hartford and 28 of the surrounding communities. And the foundation places a great deal of value on the significance and the legacy of Black philanthropy. Its benefit to the Black community, but Black philanthropy has a benefit that emanates well beyond the Black community. It benefits the entire community. And the Black Giving Circle is an important part of that. It helps keeps us grounded and connected. It helps us extend our reach to be present and aware of the many challenges and opportunities that face the Black community. And by doing so, those individuals that Shari alluded to that give of their time and their talent, they are mirroring and representing philanthropy at its absolute best. The Black Giving Circle Fund absolutely and unequivocally helps us to accomplish our mission. I'm excited, and I hope you are tonight, about the panelists that we have. Panelists who hail from our very own region and other parts of the country. Jelani Cobb, Velada Fullwood, and Leah Wright-Rigar, all of whom have made a name for themselves, both in their profession, in their intellect, their ability to connect in a way that resonates with not only Black philanthropists, but with people across the region. This discussion couldn't be more timely. We are facing crises of cataclysmic proportion. There are the dual pandemics of the COVID-19, which has brought the world to its knees to a certain extent. But then there's the other pandemic that has been present in this country for more than 400 years, the pandemic of structural and systemic racism, the inequities and the disparities, and all the things that have been born out of that pandemic of racism. And when you overlay the two, it really lays bare the challenges that we yet face as a country, and the challenges more specifically that we face as trying to navigate the environment and society in which we live. This also couldn't be more timely because as many of you may have seen last night, the abject failure of leadership that has been even more detrimental in this country. When we saw what was billed as a presidential debate just devolve into something that none of us can be proud of. None of us would even imagine, for those of you who have children, that you would want to see your child engage in such a discussion, or such a, whatever you want to call it. I've seen so many descriptions, but I'm sure we have. But what it says to us is that we can't simply sit back and rely on others to lead us out of this. We can't expect others to have our interests at heart more than we do ourselves. There is absolutely an obligation that we expect and demand from our public leaders. There's an absolute obligation and participation that we demand and expect from a larger society, but it has to start with us. And that is why we are so pleased and excited that this is a part of a series that we've had luminaries come in, and the three luminaries that we have this evening in terms of our guest panelists, I have no doubt in my mind are going to continue to elevate the discussion, to challenge us, to inspire us, to do everything that we can, and then a little bit more, to ensure that the philanthropy that has forever existed in the African American Black community is brought to bear on the challenges and the opportunities that we are facing as a society, even right now, here as we sit this evening. So that being the case, thank you for your participation, for your commitment that has led up to this day. Thank you in advance for all the things that will occur after this, and we're eager to get started. So now I am happy to introduce the Black Giving Circles Fund Steering Committee Co-Chair, Brenda Delgado.
Thank you so much, Jay. On behalf of me and the other co-chair, Chris Cloud, as well as the steering committee for the Black Giving Circle, I want to also welcome each of you to the Black Giving Circle Fund series and provide a brief overview of the fund. The Black Giving Circle Fund was established in June of 2015, and it is a permanent endowed fund of the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving. Its mission is to create substantial change in the Black community by leveraging the philanthropic efforts of donors and celebrating Black philanthropy. As a giving circle, the membership learns about critical issues facing Greater Hartford's Black community and pool their contributions to award grants to address and have impact on these particular issues. In 2019, we had 80 members of the Black Giving Circle, and currently our total fund balance is $251,516.80. The Black Giving Circle thus far has awarded $60,000 to local nonprofits in the Hartford region who serve our communities, and we will be awarding an additional $20,000 during this year once we review the grants. To be part of the Black Giving Circle, there's an annual minimum contribution, and that's $365. And that concept obviously is $1 a day. The membership is open to everyone, and we encourage you to visit the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving website for additional information, or I'm sure you can get in touch with Shari Anderson. Next, I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator for the evening, Joelle Murchison, who is the founder and principal of Exec Mommy Group, LLC. The Exec Mommy Group is an inclusion, leadership, and coaching consulting practice. Joelle combines her passion and expertise in education, equity, and inclusion and communications in her work as the founder and principal of this group. She is a career diversity and inclusion champion, a graduate of Brown University, Harvard Graduate School of Education, and Syracuse's University of School of Public Communications. She also currently serves as an adjunct faculty member at the University of Connecticut School of Business. A native of Queens, Joelle was raised in Long Island, New York, and she takes her professional and leadership cues from her mother, who was the first African-American woman manager in the Social Security Administration in the 70s. Joelle began her career in higher education, followed by a stint in the nonprofit sector, then transitioning to corporate America, first with United Technologies, and then as the inaugural Chief Diversity Officer at Travelers Insurance in Hartford. Joelle subsequently returned to higher education in 2016 as also the first Chief Diversity Officer at the University of Connecticut before launching her own business, EMG. She is the recipient of numerous awards. She serves as the chair of the board of RE Center, which is Race and Equity in Education, formerly known as the Discovery Center, and is a director on the board of the Amistad Center and College Possible, a national nonprofit focused on college access. Most recently, Joelle was elected to serve as a trustee of the Corporation of Brown University, its decision-making body. Her most important accomplishment, however, is Joelle is the mother of 4 children between the ages of 5 and 17 who are the wind beneath her wings. At her core, she is passionate about encouraging and inspiring all people to reach their highest potential, and about creating space for open dialogue to enhance inclusion and understanding. Joelle, I'm happy to welcome you as our moderator, and I turn the microphone over to you.
Thank you so much, Brenda. I really appreciate the very generous introduction. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for taking the time out to join us this evening for this very important conversation on Black philanthropy and action, moving towards a more equitable and just society. I have to say, as one of the founding members of the Black Giving Circle Fund, it is really an honor to be here as we acknowledge 5 years of literally putting our hand to the plow in action to enhance and create sustainable communities here within the greater Hartford area. 6 years ago, approximately this fall, right here in Hartford, back when we could go out and gather together in large scale, we gathered at the Bond Ballroom, if I remember correctly, to an event that the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving invited us to, allowing us to explore philanthropy, and specifically its meaning as it related to the Black community. You see, many of us would not consider ourselves philanthropists. We would say that we give back, because certainly to whom much is given, much is required. That has been a core in the context of our cultural reality as a Black community. But that evening was different. We began to understand just what philanthropy really meant. And I think for many individuals in the room, they were much more empowered, recognizing that the gifts that they had provided, whether in time, talent, or treasure, all contributed to the context of Black philanthropy. That evening, indeed, was the catalyst that began the Black Giving Circle Fund that we celebrate this evening. So fast forward, in early June, just after the killing of George Floyd, our community began to ignite, if you will, in a variety of ways. And in one example in particular related to philanthropy, 8 corporate leaders of color in Boston came together to form the new Commonwealth Racial Equity and Social Justice Fund. The fund focuses on 4 key issues, similarly to the Black Giving Circle, for communities of color specifically: policing and criminal justice reform, healthcare equity, economic empowerment, and youth education. From their beginnings of 8, in just a few short months, the fund now totals 19 members and is run exclusively by people of color. Their goal was to raise $100 million. And so what we see is that from our beginnings over 6 years ago here in Hartford, in terms of informally, we continue to see a trend of individuals within the Black community taking their own responsibility for becoming leaders in philanthropy that is directed specifically towards the Black community. And so we're here this evening with these esteemed panelists to begin to explore the issue even further. As was referenced by our president, Jay Williams, clearly our society is at a crossroads. There is a need and an opportunity for us to impact change in a variety of different ways. And so tonight we'll talk about the way that philanthropy can begin to impact those ways, but also, as we know, since of course we are coming off the heels of a very interesting conversation last night, we have much work to do. And so I think we are very fortunate to have with us three of the foremost scholars in our community who will help us to navigate through these issues. So I'm going to give a brief introduction of each of them. They are incredible and talented individuals individually in their own right. And then at that point, I will ask each of them to take a moment, once I have made the introduction, to take a brief moment to just reflect on the topic for this evening. And then we have a number of questions that have come in from many of you who are viewing, as well as those that we've curated within the Black Giving Circle that will allow us the opportunity to really engage this evening. You all certainly have the opportunity to participate as well. You can certainly submit questions via the chat or the Q&A feature, and we will accommodate them as best we can. So with no further ado, allow me to introduce to you our first panelist this evening, Dr. Jelani Cobb. Dr. Cobb is the Ira A. Lipman Professor of Journalism at Columbia University. He first joined the journalism school faculty in 2016. In fact, Dr. Cobb left UConn just as I was arriving. Our paths actually never crossed. So it's really nice to see you. Everyone assumed that we were there at the same time, but he'd already headed south to Columbia.
I was waiting for that to come up.
So fast, I didn't even get a chance. In any case, he's also been a contributor to The New Yorker since 2012 and became a staff writer in 2015. He is the recipient of the 2015 Sidney Hillman Award for Opinion and Analysis, and frequently writes about race, politics, history, and culture. As I just referenced, prior to Columbia, Dr. Cobb was an associate professor of history and director of the Africana Studies Institute at the University of Connecticut, where he specialized in post-Civil War African-American history.
That's enough. That's enough.
You don't want me to read all of that, right?
Yeah,
I
that's
felt
just
the
basic.
same way when Brenda was reading. Like, how do I stop her at this point?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, well, I know for sure that there are some folks on this call who, if I did not read this last sentence in your bio, I might never be able to moderate again. Mm-hmm. He is a graduate of Howard University.
Oh, yeah, that's important.
And Rutgers University, where he received his doctorate in American history. So yes, all of you Bison, I just want you to know that I did indeed read that that sentence. And so thank you, Dr. Cobb, for joining us this evening. I think it probably makes sense for you to share a few words and reflect, and then I will move forward and introduce our other esteemed panelists. Dr. Cobb?
Sure. I mean, I think that this is literally one of those where do you start kind of situations, because we all saw the conversation last night, or most of us saw. If we didn't see it, we heard about it. I had a different reaction from most people. I was not shocked. I was not surprised. I think there was nothing that happened in that conversation that we could not have predicted previously would happen. But one of the things that it did reaffirm was the extent to which we are on our own. We are on our own. We always have been to some degree or another, but our fortunes will, by and large, be determined by what we can do. And this is a sobering, what we can do for ourselves. This is a sobering realization, I think, that we have allies or we have friends, but fundamentally, we will rise or fall by our own efforts. Now, I have complicated feelings about that situation. And when I was reading the study that showed that African Americans, the Kellogg study that showed that African Americans, by and large, give a larger share of their income to charitable organizations, although we don't tend to think of that as philanthropy. The word for that is survival. That we've been confronted with this, that the responsibility for our communities has been shunted onto our shoulders in particular ways that we know we inherited this knowledge from our parents and from their parents before them. back to that first generation of ancestors that had any option outside of the institution of slavery, any capacity to build and defend ourselves. And one of the other things that I found when I was just doing some research on fugitive runaway slaves in Maryland, and they found that, yes, there was an underground railroad, but it was very common, and in some instances more common, that people who were attempting to escape the institution of slavery would receive assistance from other people who were enslaved, meaning that people who were not free, who would risk beatings and punishment to help someone else get free. It said that many of the people who escaped had received help from 4 to 6 other enslaved individuals. That's a giving circle. That's the ancestral giving circle. This is where we come to this question. And so the other part of it, the reason why I said I have complicated feelings about this issue is that we often hear directed at us, whenever there's a problem, what are you all doing to clean up your communities? Or what are you all doing to address this problem or that problem? When there's an issue of crime, especially, we hear this very often, why aren't you all doing anything to fix this? Well, what are you doing about white people on opioids? That's never the question that we hear. What are you doing about the problem of domestic violence that has occurred in many white communities, particularly since we've seen the rise of COVID and quarantine? What are you doing? We can list a litany of problems, but beyond the general idea of kind of civic good-heartedness, it's never presumed that the well-being of another white person, the responsibility of a person who doesn't know them, doesn't share family or community lineage with them, doesn't have any connection with them other than the accident of their epidermis. So to the extent, but we do believe that society has a role in providing opportunity for people. To the extent that these burdens have fallen on our shoulders, it is not only a metric of our responsibility, of our capacity, and just the plain pragmatism of helping each other so that we might all rise, as Mary McLeod Bethune talked about, but also a measure of the gap between our humanity and the willingness of the broader American society to recognize it, or our citizenship and the capacity of the American state to recognize it. And so whenever someone raises this question of what are you doing to fix your communities, I say, I pay taxes. What about you? And so when we come to this place, we're looking at a responsibility that we have taken up wholeheartedly and passed on from generation to generation, but which any decent and honest assessment would say should never have been on our shoulders in the first place. And so in that regard, I think that we are, it's important to be able to participate in this conversation. People who are doing the extra credit work of democracy, of going above and beyond what they have already done, what has already been taken out of their paychecks, what has already been placed upon them in the responsibility to vote, the various things that we see as the metric of your involvement in the society that you belong to, and the essential extra work that we have done, knowing that we have to lift as we climb, knowing that the society may not recognize our full humanity in the short term.
Excellent, excellent. You've certainly already provided us with some real food for thought as we navigate through this. This is simply a part of who we are, literally as a people, and yet it appears that we are responsible for our own journey. So let's talk a little bit more about that. I will introduce our second panelist, Velada Fullwood. Velada, and I love this, is the way that her bio is written. She's described as an idea whisperer. She is the award-winning author of Giving Back, a 400-page hardcover book profiling stories of philanthropy among African Americans that was developed in partnership with photographer Charles Thomas. Velada is featured in a 2013 TED Talk on philanthropy and was named the 2014 Lake Distinguished Visitor at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. In 2015, Valeta collaborated with HBCUs and museums and other cultural institutions to launch the multimedia touring exhibition Giving Back, the Soul of Philanthropy Reframed and Exhibited. The exhibit has attracted major funding, has been hosted by 24 communities, and continues to tour cities nationwide. Valeta's writing and projects are featured on her website, velada.com, and she enjoys connections on social media. I happened to come across just briefly a op-ed that Velada has written recently called Giving Black Matters. And she talks about the context of percentage of giving of philanthropy to Black communities and the opportunities in particular that we have at this moment in time. And so without any further ado, I would introduce to you and welcome her for opening remarks, Velada Fullwood.
I'm grateful to be here tonight. And as Joelle described the circumstances 6 years ago, when the idea and the work around the Black Giving Circle Fund was established in Hartford, I was in the room that day, and I'm very excited to be a keynote speaker and to talk about Black philanthropy and how I was inspired through my involvement in a giving circle to create a giving circle and to write the book Giving Back, which eventually became the exhibit, The Soul of Philanthropy. So I have a special affinity for the Black Giving Circle in Hartford. I feel like I was something of a midwife to its birthing 5-6 years ago. So I congratulate you on 6 years. I know it takes a lot of hard work and commitment to come together as a giving circle. I'm a member of one, as I mentioned, here in Charlotte, North Carolina. We just celebrated our 14th year, and I wish you equal longevity. And I'm inspired by tonight's conversation in the title and the fact that you've brought people together around this conversation at this time. I tuned in to the first event in your series and was inspired and motivated by those conversations with Latasha and Nicole, and pleased to be here tonight.
Thank you so much. And we should say welcome back. And
Yes.
Thank you for the catalyst that you inspired us with that evening. Our third panelist this evening, I was preparing to say last, but certainly not least, is a friend of Hartford, our dear sister, Dr. Leah Wright-Rigueur. Dr. Rigueur is an associate professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School and the Harry S. Truman Associate Professor of American History at Brandeis University. She is also an ABC News contributor. Some of you have probably seen her very recently on Good Morning America, in addition to many other news shows. As a trained political historian, her scholarship and research expertise includes 20th century US political and social history and modern African American history with an emphasis on race and political ideology. We will be really interested to hear her research and expertise as it relates to the American presidential election, of which we are in the midst right now. Dr. Rigueur's award-winning book, The Loneliness of the Black Republican, Pragmatic Politics and the Pursuit of Power, covers more than 4 decades of American political and social history and examines the ideas and actions of Black officials and politicians from the era of the New Deal to Ronald Reagan's presidential ascent in 1980. At both the Harvard Kennedy School and Brandeis, Dr. Rigueur leads the Race and American Politics Initiative, a multidisciplinary series of seminars and roundtables addressing the most pressing issues in race and American politics. In addition to her commentating on ABC News, she has also been featured in many other media outlets: MSNBC, CNN, CBS News, PBS, NPR, the New York Times, the Washington Post, C-SPAN, The Atlantic, and many, many more. She holds a PhD in history from Princeton University and a BA in history from Dartmouth. So not to be outdone by our dear friends who are Bison and the HBCU network, I welcome my dear Black Ivy League sister, Dr. Leah Wright-Rigueur.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. And thank you, it's really a pleasure to be here. I wanted to remark very, very quick, because full plate and a full agenda for talking about it, and I'm really eager to Q&A. But there are 3 points essentially that I want to be thinking about this idea of not just Black philanthropy, but also social movements and Black community equity and equality. And the first is that we're at a moment of extreme urgency. Now, I say that within the knowledge, or with the full knowledge, that we've always been at a point of urgency or full urgency for the crisis of democracy for Black people, because Black people have never experienced full democracy or full equality or even full citizenship within this country. With that being said, there's a lot of emphasis on, what did people do in the 1960s, or this is what happened in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. Well, we have to actually stop talking about those moments in order to understand we're going through one of those moments in the present, right? Point is that the intersection, right? So the dual pandemics of COVID-19 and essentially racial injustice have exposed just how weak and fragile the system is. And I think that's something that we have to talk about, particularly as it connects not only to kind of social justice and these various movements, but also in thinking about how Black philanthropy, broadly interpreted, broadly understood, because we know that Black people do philanthropy different, and we do it special and we do it well. But thinking about broadly how those things intersect and how they have exposed just how much America has failed Black people and what we can do in order to push America to be better, so that we can move to a moment where we experience democracy as we deserve. And the last point that I hope we can talk about is thinking about philanthropy across racial groups and really pushing philanthropy to reform itself, for philanthropy to be better and to think differently. Because the honest truth is, moment of crisis, not just of American, but a moment of crisis in philanthropy, and how those two things is really important for us moving forward. So I'll stop there and turn it back over to you, Joelle.
Thank you so much, Leah. Why don't we start exactly where you ended? And let's talk about philanthropy and the notion of philanthropy, what it was, what it is, and what it must become. I have to ask you all a bit of a provocative question. Do you believe that philanthropy, as we know it, is broken? Any one of you can respond. I can't see you all on my screen, so please feel free.
I'm happy to jump in.
Great.
Yeah, so the way I see it is, no, I don't think philanthropy is broken. I think certain aspects of the work maybe, or some of the institution or sector has some work to do. But I think first and foremost, philanthropy is a practice. And while there is a philanthropic industry, and oftentimes when we talk about philanthropy, people think of the philanthropic sector and the industry around that. And I think of the personal practice as well as the institutions that exist and that are part of the big definition around philanthropy. And so when I think about Black philanthropy and our giving, I think there are things we can do better and tap into some of our traditions and roots around giving. And when I look at the institutions of philanthropy, I do think that there are structures and systems that exist that reflect the people who have created these institutions and who lead these institutions. So I definitely think there's work to do and a serious time for some redress in terms of how institutions engage and connect with communities, particularly Black communities.
So let's actually expand on that just a bit. You've alluded to, in many instances, the structure of philanthropy and those who essentially lead philanthropy, those who tend to be most prominent in terms of making decisions around philanthropy, particularly to the Black community. How do we then begin to eradicate the racial and social injustice that by default is present in philanthropy, the structure or the practice as we know it?
So I can jump in here a little bit, Joelle, and just say I want to think about a couple of things here, including just gently kind of pushing back on the idea that philanthropy isn't broken. I should allege that, white philanthropy is broken, and white philanthropy perhaps is not working in interests, working in Black America's best interests. One of the things that I want is that there's been a lot of study and a lot of research that has come out that shows, for example, philanthropy and white philanthropists can actually end up influencing movements, particularly social justice movements, for the negative, right? Or actually pushing them in the direction that they see fit, as opposed to where Black people want them to go. And so I want us to think about that. If anybody's interested, there's a article on this by Megan Ming Francis, highly recommended. I want us to think about why that is, what we can do to philanthropy, broader philanthropic organizations in the direction we need to go in. The second thing is really think about, why do we invest specifically in ideas as opposed to individuals, right? We make people jump through all of these, particularly around philanthropy, in order to fund them. And what ends up happening is end up in the same organizations, the same institutions, and the same people over and over and over again. And we end up missing a lot of people on the ground who are doing excellent and innovative work, right, across the board. And then the third thing here is really think about how Black people have been innovative in Black in philanthropic organizations, not simply by the idea of giving money, right? We also give time, we also give energy, we also give resources. And so I think perhaps if we expand that creatively, we can really think about changing some of these structural problems that exist in the philanthropic world.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jelani, you talked a little bit about, in your introduction, the notion of slaves helping slaves, right? Many of us know, of course, of Harriet Tubman and those stories, but talk a little bit about that. I think, to Leah's point, what's happening within philanthropy that is occurring within the Black community? Talk a little bit about that history that we have and how we might see that playing out today.
Well, I mean, I think that so much of what we talk about, like the involvement, has been philanthropic, in a way that we don't, because we typically think of philanthropy as a person with a high net value, dispensing funds to various causes through specific channels with a grant processing apparatus attached, and specific benchmarks and those kinds of things. That's the mindset that we have for understanding philanthropy. But to Leah's point, like, if we simply talk about these acts that are giving, that express the love of humanity or love of man, which is what philanthropy is, then it broadens out what we understand this to be. And so the whole array of personal sacrifices, that aren't understood in the traditional kinds of networks. The involvement of churches, I don't think that most, or it's probably a higher proportion of Black churches that, for instance, have a fund to help people pay their utility bills if it comes to the point where people have difficulty in doing that, or people have the ability to say that we have these people here who can watch your kids, knowing that you don't have the money to pay while you have to get this job, or you don't get off work until this particular time, or the kind of informal transactional things that people do that are helpful, help people get by, quite frankly. And so I think that's the place that we come from. The other thing that I think about in terms of philanthropy, and I don't know, I didn't respond about being broken because I don't know if broken is the right word for it, but there's a kind of dawning recognition of this, that it's creeping along. But the presumption has always been that there are experts. When you see a problem, there is an expert who can tell you the solution that should be administered to this problem. But it is less likely, especially in kind of philanthropic circles, to say that the people who are actually experiencing this problem have insight and can give solutions to what they understand intimately. What is the problem of unemployment, or what is the problem of lack of healthcare, or what is the problem, whatever the issue is that people are attempting to address. And so, now, one of the examples, most recent examples of this was the referendum last year that restored voting rights to a large swath of people who had previously had felony convictions in the state of Florida. That campaign was begun, organized, culminated, was successful. It was done entirely by people who are former offenders, people who had been grappling with this problem themselves. And so I think that there's less recognition of the kind of internal organic solutions to problems and a kind of reliance on the interpreter model of it, in which there's a person typically affiliated with the university or a think tank or a kind of outside entity that from on high says this is what the problem is. Now, of course, I don't think I'm a historian, and Leah is a political scientist. I'm not here to disparage the value of social science and methodical empirical study of particular problems. That has its place. But I think that the idea of being the be all and end all about how to approach things is something that should be really seriously revisited and reevaluated.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if either the other two of you would like to jump in, but it actually made me think about the notion of, when you say, we did, or we've always done what we needed to do to get by. I certainly have seen more engagements from individuals or other individuals on behalf of friends who are experiencing food insecurity, housing insecurity, seeking support through Cash App or Venmo, which is a really interesting concept as it relates to philanthropy, right? If you're giving someone $15 in Cash App because their friends said they need to be able to pay their rent. I've seen a lot of that, particularly in our creative community and in the arts. Are people considering that philanthropy? Do they feel like that is indeed being philanthropic? It's an interesting nuance that we see today, with the rise of certainly Cash App, but also GoFundMe and similar kinds of outlets. I mean, is that philanthropy?
I'll speak up and I'll say, yeah, I consider it philanthropy. I think when you embrace the root meaning, as Jelani mentioned, about the love of humankind, the love of what it means to be human at its core, yes. And I also think that part of the power of giving circles is because we are connected to community. We are the people proximate to many of the issues in our community and have a unique line of sight and ideas and solutions that may not exist or haven't existed historically in institutional philanthropy. And I think also one of the strengths I've found in being part of a collective giving group is that we get to know institutional philanthropy. While we have these ancestral knowing and traditions that we lift up and are part of our families and communities, that is the Black community, knowing institutional philanthropy, that's often a blind spot for us. Many of us don't have parents or grandparents that have philanthropic funds or donor advised funds or foundations. So some of the language and strategies and ways of institutional philanthropy are unknown to us and mysterious. So giving circles provide an opportunity to connect with institutional philanthropy, understand some of the practices, ways, mindset, and values. And then together we can bring our cultural knowledge and then some of our insights in philanthropy to help influence and change philanthropy while also engaging in traditional ways of giving back, whether through mutual aid groups that are popping up now in the pandemic and other ways we have traditionally given and supported each other and been reciprocal with each other as Black people.
So I just want to point out things. One, which is that the technological aspect of like GoFundMe, Kickstarter, right? All of these kind of broader philanthropic campaigns that we're seeing, PayPal, or people are, putting this in their bio or something like that. Those are technological advances, but they've also been there in different ways and form generations, right? We've been doing this for different ways. Thinking about, say, things like rent parties, thinking about things like fashion shows, right? Church basement parties, things like that, collective. So it's not necessarily that new, but the technological aspect is really important and opens it up into an entirely new world. And part of that, though, is that I think it's important to represent that while it's part of this kind of philosophic giving that we're talking about, it's also about paying people for their labor, right? Which is an important part of how we should be understanding philanthropy, and particularly how we should think about Black people in this intersection of democracy. All too often, we don't value people for the providing in moments like this, although Black people often do. But now we have a new technological platform that actually allows people, right, to donate to people, so to make up for the labor and the expertise people are providing in a particular moment. And that is incredibly powerful, and it's an incredibly powerful tool that we should think about how we can utilize that much more effectively going to the future.
It's interesting when you said that. It made me think of some of the commentary that I've seen around that in terms of paying people for their labor. Certainly Black Women's Equal Pay Day in August, it took us all the way until August to make what a white male has made in the prior year. But it also made me think about the notion of reparations. And I know that takes us in a whole different direction for a whole different panel. But I have heard in this same vein, individuals referencing their personal ability to provide reparations through paying people for their labor, dropping $5 or $10 or $20 in Black women's Cash App, right? To your point, putting your PayPal in your bio and things of that nature. What do you think about that? Is that sort of the new age mechanism of institutions or really individuals being able to provide reparations? Let's talk. I'd be interested in your thoughts around that.
Who are you asking?
Any of you, but please, Jelani.
Oh, so I think that's helpful. That's interesting, but at the risk of kind of going into a whole other conversation, when we talk about reparations, we're talking about a much bigger institutional set of questions that goes from all of the mechanisms that through which wealth has been expropriated from particular communities, and that is through the mortgage lending industry, for all of the home equity that Black people don't have, for the lost wages for people who are unemployable because they were sentenced to prison for offenses that white people would not be sentenced to prison for. That's not talking about slavery.
Right.
I had this conversation with Ta-Nehisi Coates fairly regularly. If we just said, we will spot you slavery, we will spot you everything that happened from 1619 to 1865, there is a very significant case. If we went to 1619 to 1900, just on the institutional practices of the 20th century, we would have a very serious argument about the structural inequalities that happen. And so I think that that is well-meaning and well-intentioned, but what we're talking about when we talk about reparations is kind of a stronger class dynamic. One of the things I also point out, by the way, is the United States did pay reparations for slavery. We don't ever talk about that. In 1862, where the federal government issued payments upon the emancipation of people who were enslaved in Washington, D.C. I think I should be very specific about this, that they issued reparations to white people. They paid them for the cost of losing their slave labor.
Mm.
The people who were enslaved received nothing, even though their labor produced wealth, which was sold, and the United States government federally instituted taxes on the product that they produced, meaning that the government derived direct benefit from slavery itself and this tax revenue. Not a penny was given to any of these enslaved people. And so when we talk about reparations, it's not without precedent.
Absolutely. You know, you referenced the structural inequality that exists. We know of the legacy of slavery and how it continues to rear its ugly head, if you will, in today's system. So let's shift gears as we think about some of the systemic impact, particularly to the Black community, and the role that that philanthropy has played and should play moving forward as we think about things like healthcare, as you referenced, housing. Or lack of access to affordable housing, education, the continued, certainly here in Connecticut, it seems ever widening achievement gap. How should philanthropy play a role in beginning to sort of close some of the gaps that have been created as it relates to systemic inequity in any of those particular areas?
Is that for me?
It could be for anyone.
Oh, for anyone, good. I'll be quiet, I've been talking a lot.
So I'll say one thing on this, which is that philanthropy is a necessary measure, but it's also a stopgap measure. And so this is just kind of going back to the point that Jelani was making earlier, because the wrongs that were done to African Americans are such and were so kind of comprehensive and so calculated and so deliberate. Any kind of effort or investment is going to solve for that is going to have to be large scale, structural, on the level of federal, right? So what philanthropy ends up doing in the meantime, propping up the very of Black people in this, right, in this interim, right, in this space of democracy. And I think in that respect, it can be very powerful. But again, it's a necessary stopgap measure. So if we think about the 1960s, and again, I want to take this really big view of what philanthropy can mean. When we think about bailouts in the 1960s during the civil rights movement, that was a necessary stop measure in order to continue and to perpetuate the movement. It was an important part of the movement. When we think about voting rights and when we think about the power of Black voters, souls to the polls, which is, time in terms of time and resources is kind of it was a necessary measure. These are the ways in which I think philanthropy can be incredibly powerful. And what I'll say here is that a couple of people, somebody like Derek Hamilton, for example, recently, who's a really wonderful economist, get a very, very long philanthropic grant recently, which enabled him to do the kind of thinking and theorizing and planning for really exploding these ideas of what we can do in order to change the United States and begin to reach full equality. That's where philanthropy comes in and plays a critical role, particularly moving forward.
Can I add something really quick to the point that Leah was making? We're talking about informal philanthropy. Let's just be very direct and personal about it. My father had a third grade education, not through any matter of his own initiatives, because he grew up in Hazelhurst, Georgia. They didn't allow Negroes to go past third grade when he was coming up there. And so I have a PhD. And that's a highly atypical outcome for what was a kind of deliberate attempt to create intergenerational poverty. And so, because I have a PhD and I have a tenured job at a university, and I don't in any given month have to worry about how I'm going to pay my basic expenses, I have an array of other family members who are looking at me and saying, not necessarily for extravagances, but quite frankly, I am paying for the dormitory for one niece. I paid for books for a nephew. I have relatives, I have an extended giving network that comes directly out of my pocket. This is not atypical. When we talk with Black professionals, the entire conversation that we have with Black professionals, especially as we know that how commonplace it is for Black middle-class people to have relatives, close relatives sometimes, who are working class or even poor. And so what we find is that when you see a person's salary, that is not just simply their income, it is partly a subsidy for these family members. Now, were it for the fact that my father and his siblings were able to go past elementary school, would the likelihood of that responsibility being on my shoulders be less? Yes, it would. So would be the case for so many of the people we know. But when we have these conversations around how you generate wealth and how you have intergenerational connections to it and where people's money actually goes, that is just a very real part of it. That doesn't count as philanthropy. No one's going to say that that's philanthropy. When I do my taxes, that is not a charitable deduction. But it is also, it is what it is though, is policy. It's related to public policy and it's filling in the gap of what public policy has done or not done over these years.
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent point, because that indeed is philanthropy, right? And as I said earlier, to whom much is given, much is required. It is an expectation from a community perspective that we, particularly those of us who have made it, quote unquote, from an education perspective, are expected to, and I think even beyond the expectation, I think we feel an accountability to ensure that those young people who come behind us continue to have the same kind of, or afforded the same kind of benefits that we were. Let's be real, we still have individuals in our families who, if you were speaking to immediate family, are still first generation
Right.
college students. And I think that is a very real, a very real component of this conversation that we're talking about. Absolutely.
I'll just add one thing, and I'm going to shut up because it's like, it is true, to much whom is given, much is required. The other part of it that they don't tell you is that to whom nothing is given, even more is required.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. Now, everyone is ready to transition to talking about the role of philanthropy in this election. And I was waiting until we got through some of the other commentary because I knew that the moment that we transitioned into anything connected to the election, that was where we were going to sit. And so I am going to ask the question that has been asked a couple of times in our chat and that we received. What role can and should Black philanthropy or philanthropy in general play in the context of the November election? And this is to any of you to begin.
I mean, I can start us off since everyone else is being shy. And I'll say very quickly that there are a number of different ways that philanthropy can be used in the November election. You know, if we're talking about, again, informal means of philanthropy, souls to the polls, driving people, poll, what do they call them? Poll watchers, people providing a network of support in order to ensure
that democracy and that the rights of citizenship that people are entitled to are incredibly important. The idea of, we've recently seen this across the country, a number of different organizations have picked up on this and are providing this, but a number of different organizations are paying, say, bail fines, and I know, Jelana, you mentioned this as well, bail fines for formerly incarcerated individuals that will allow them to participate in the November election. We've seen people donating resources in terms of their time, especially including, lawyers and legal experts who are helping people, not just with the process of voting, but with electoral law more generally, right? Think about Georgia and think about the New Voter Project of Georgia, which is Stacey Abrams' project, and how they're actually involved in the process of registering people to vote. So there are any number of ways, and I think we're just, I'm just hitting like the very, very tippy top of the iceberg through which people can get involved in November.
Yes, I'll add, in terms of institutional philanthropy, even giving circles, supporting organizations that are working to counter the disinformation that's occurring, to counter the voter suppression that's occurring, supporting organizations and organizers who are tuned in and addressing what's going on with this election.
Absolutely.
I also want to point out that I think, one of the really key issues for this election has to do with, say, voter suppression, but it also has to do with voter depression and alienation and turnout, right? And enthusiasm. And we've heard a lot of conversation about perhaps, maybe the enthusiasm level is not there amongst Black communities, particularly younger Black Americans, where I think actually Black philanthropic circles can get involved is in doing the kind of structural changes or institutional changes that lead people to become more involved in the electoral process. And that doesn't necessarily mean going out and say, I'm going to register you to vote, although that does count, or driving people to the polls, or say preaching to people about, lecturing them about, voting is really important and voting is good. But instead, what we see is that when people are receiving the benefits, the full benefits of systems, right, or access to the systems, they become much more enthusiastic about the political process. So if you address root issues, such as root causes like inequality, then all of a sudden that translates into support for the political process, right? So if you prove to people that the system is not failing them, they actually will become more involved. I think we saw that a lot with the protests that erupted in the aftermath of George Floyd's death, where we saw people protesting, taking to the streets, the largest mass movement that the globe has ever seen, 26 million people. But as part and parcel of that, we saw that voter registration among African Americans skyrocketed. It went through the roof in the aftermath of those protests. So when we begin to address and intersect the two, right, that's actually where we see an enormous potential for investment in something like the presidential election.
One other example I'll share specifically from our giving circle is that we recently sponsored a workshop, the Op-Ed Project and Right to Change the World workshop, to give the skills and know-how to more people in the community about writing op-eds and adding commentary and opinion on a variety of policies and issues. And so to Leah's point and other points made earlier, investing in individuals. So we, through support with funding partners, were able to sponsor a private workshop for 40 Black leaders, people, grassroots organizers, corporate responsibility professionals, Black people in foundations, Giving Circle members, pretty much the whole spectrum, nonprofit leaders, who were able to participate and get some of the know-how to be able to influence through their writing and through also their thinking and communication around the need for policy changes, from everything from climate justice to women's issues and everything in between.
Yeah, that's a great point. I want to connect that back to one of the comments that Leah made, because I think there is very much a generational component here as well. Philanthropy, I think, if we were to look at it in its most traditional sense, is typically seen as something that is in the purview of those who are a bit more seasoned. And it is carried out in a very specific way. marry that with the conversation that we're having about communication and alternative forms of providing service, your talent, your time. How do we then sort of close that generational gap in terms of leveraging maybe even the traditional philanthropic sources to connect to some of those grassroots on the ground actions that have proven to be necessary as it relates to enhancing our ability, certainly as it relates to the election, but in general for the Black community? Leah, you look like you wanted to respond, so please feel free to do
Oh no, I was actually looking at my little box. I was looking at Jelani. I want to hear how Jelani responds to this question.
Okay, Jelani.
Well, I'm sorry, can you give me that question again?
Sure. Leah had referenced sort of the notion of the on the ground support. You know, many, as we know, many of the protests that were held across the country were represented by generations that would not traditionally be considered to fall within what we know to be philanthropy.
Mm-hmm.
But we recognize that some of those traditional sources still have significant resources. How do we begin to make those connections in ways that can be impactful as we look at the election and beyond for the Black community?
Yeah. Can I tell a story for a second and then answer that?
Absolutely.
Harry Belafonte has this great story that he tells about getting a call. This must have been 1963 or so, or 64, getting a call from some SNCC members in Mississippi saying that they needed money to continue the work that they were doing. And, you know, they kind of needed it in a rush. You know, I don't know if this was for bail or whatever it was for, but he says, well, okay, we're going to figure this out. We'll get the money to you. And it was substantial sums, like $75,000 or something like to that effect. And he said that he then picked up the phone and called Sidney Poitier and said, what are you doing this weekend? And he said, nothing much. And he said, I'm thinking of taking a quick trip to Mississippi. And so he says, sure, but he doesn't quite know all that this trip entails. And they show up at this airport. Belafonte had called ahead of time to see if anyone in the Kennedy DOJ could arrange for there to be escorts with them to protect them, because they're flying into Mississippi as two Negroes with $75,000 meant for civil rights work. And so they're told that everything is set up, and there'll be people there to meet them in the airport. They get to the airport, and the airport is completely empty except for them. And so they drive they get on the road, and they get a car that comes up behind them and is like shining their high beams and deliberately intimidating them, and rides right behind them for the whole way through. And they know that these are like two Black men. And what you had was the two most famous Black people in America, two of the most famous people, period, in America, in Mississippi in the middle of the night, with white people behind them in a car trying to intimidate them out of doing the work that they were doing. And so they eventually managed to get the money to him. He said that Sidney Poitier turned to him and said, never call me again. And so I think that I said to say that there have been these kind of non-traditional means of getting support for movements for a really long time. And some of this is now, you know, that people have Twitter, people have social media, there's a way of kind of highlighting, you know, what's going on. But really, quite frankly, I think what philanthropy really should be doing is listening to the people who are most actively on the ground there, because they know those networks, they know how these things happen, how these things work, they know what they need, and the means by which they can achieve it better. And so I think that there's a point to kind of reiterate the theme of what I've been saying previously. There's a real significance and a point to listening to the people who are actually involved in this work in the communities where they're doing it.
Absolutely.
Joelle, I'll share example as well. When early on with my giving circle, I mentioned that work with the circle inspired the book Giving Back. And then later we were able to reimagine the book as the Soul of Philanthropy exhibit. And I will give a shout out to Hartford Black Giving Circle, because actually, even before the Giving Circle existed, Hartford Foundation was one of the first cities to host our pop-up edition of the Soul of Philanthropy exhibit. And later, when we received major funding to make it a bigger, more comprehensive museum exhibition, we partnered with the HBCU here in Charlotte, North Carolina, Johnson C. Smith, and created the Soul of Philanthropy as a way to engage people across generations and really across race as well. But having the input from students at Johnson C. Smith and building and envisioning an exhibit that could speak across generations and would interest and intrigue college students and even younger students was really important, because I think some of our traditions and ancestral ways of surviving, as Jelani put it at the start, it is incumbent upon us to continue those stories. And I think sometimes things get lost in the mix, and even the connecting of how we do to the word philanthropy, there's a huge gap there, as we all know. And so the Soul of Philanthropy exhibit and some of this work is to bridge those connections between our ways of giving and supporting each other and of surviving is really part of the bigger practice of philanthropy. And it's it's not as tough engaging younger people around these ideas. I think so many adults and older generations have so many false notions and preconceived ideas about what it means to be a philanthropist that you have to unlearn those and push back on all those old ideas. And younger generations get the connection immediately, and it's less of a task to bridge our work and ways in Black communities to the broader scheme of philanthropy. And so the Soul of Philanthropy is one way we've been able to roll it out in an artful way that embraces culture and that engages people across generations to reinforce and affirm ideas around Black philanthropy.
So go ahead.
I'll just say quickly on this, very, very quickly on this, which one, the largest group of voters in the country. And all too often we just kind of to the curb and we say, they're not important. Or we suggest, well, none because they didn't bother voting. Well, we don't do. And I think it's important this to kind of general issues too, because a good portion of those voters are generational, are younger voters, is to actually stop and ask them, right? Why didn't you participate in the political? Why do you feel alienated from the process, right? And not simply just a portion of them will say, well, it was about voter suppression, I didn't have active polls, things like that. But if you actually look at some of the rationales for why they're not voting, right? These are actually rationales we can address immediately in a way that isn't condescending, in a way that isn't about lecturing to them, but is instead about understanding and meeting them where they are. And one of the things that I would say here too is thinking about, for example, just to bring it back to this idea of George Floyd, when we think about what young people are protesting about, they've been sold a bill of false goods, right? And so they didn't grow up, right, or have the experience of, say, even the good period of the 1990s, right? That moment in the 1990s where Black communities were actually like up on the upward swing, where we saw corporate diversity, right, going up amongst African Americans. What we've actually been experiencing for the last 20 years is kind of a stagnant period, and in some cases, actual regression. And so for them, when you ask them about the political process, all too often, they tell you the political process has failed them. Politicians have failed them. They're deeply disillusioned with the idea of the electoral process being solutions. They're not disillusioned with the idea of protest, right? They are very active and they will get involved in protest. They see America clearly for what it is. What they're disillusioned with are the tools with which we provide them with for answers. And so I think if you can begin to talk to people about that and have a very honest conversation about that, and then present a vision for moving beyond that, right? Like, what would your vision for America look like in an ideal scenario? then you can actually begin to bridge this gap with younger generations. And it has to be from a position of empathy and understanding with, as Jelani said, with people on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. And so as we start to wrap up this evening, I think you position perfectly the context of this conversation. You know, what can and should philanthropy be doing to support exactly what you've described? How do we bridge the gap between the disillusionment of some of our younger citizens with our society and the system that has failed them, so that they are ready to move to action? You know, we've got a short amount of time, right, where we have to really make something happen. I think we're 40 days out from the election. How do we best amplify philanthropy over these next 40 days to reach those voters that you described, reach those citizens that you described, to be able to ensure that the voice of the Black community and other underrepresented communities are heard as we go forward? And any of you can respond.
I mean, you know, I think that at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I think the answers are in the streets, or in the communities. I think that there has to be a kind of outside of the institution, you know, approach to this. You know, who are the program officers? But I think that the ideas of having program officers who have their ear to the street, you know, the way that an A&R exec does, where you're trying to find out what's going on, not the kind of passive approach that we typically have, where people are like outside and they're coming to you and you want to understand how to make this happen. Because one thing is this, there's a movement that is happening. It is not dependent, or is not waiting on the sanction, is not waiting for a grant approval, is not waiting for any of those things. Those things are happening. And it becomes the extent to which they can be helpful and which they can be formative, with bearing in mind the point that Leah made previously. And so I think that that's at least a beginning. That's part of how you begin.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to mute myself again here.
No worries.
So I think, Joelle, one of the things that people can do is, again, basically focus on the organizations. So basically philanthropic organizations, particularly large-scale Black philanthropic organizations, can look to the organizations that are on the ground already doing this work. So it's not necessary to reinvent the wheel, because there are organizations like the New Georgia Voter Project that are actually concentrated not simply on turning out likely voters. That's in political elections. I don't know if people are familiar with this. There is an overwhelming concentration on turning out likely voters, and that's important. But other organizations are now focused on expanding the voting pool and generating new voters. So looking at people who have been unlikely voters, non-voters in the past, and getting them to the polls. So one of the easiest things that we can do, not just as philanthropic organizations, but also I saw somebody in the comments mention the Divine Nine, organizations like civic groups like the Links, Girlfriends, right? Mocha Moms, all of these things that we do and that we have already in existence as institutions can support efforts like that. We can also support efforts on the ground of these kind of organizations like that fall under the umbrella of, say, Black Lives Matter. And we know that there have been a number of Black Lives Matter organizations that are not only focused on, say, ending, police abuse or the mass incarceration system or things like that, but are also focused on the electoral things. So they're on the ground. They're working on it. I know you guys a couple of weeks ago had Latasha Brown from Black Voters Matter. Supporting organizations like that are key in moments like this, right? And they're key to moments for democracy.
Thank you so much, Leah. Valeta?
I'm sharing an example from my giving circle here in Charlotte. A few years back, we experienced some social unrest after the police killed a Black man. And we were in the headlines and the news, and our giving circle struggled with what can we do at this time. And so one of the first things we did is just to focus in on our community, connect with leaders and organizations working on the ground in Charlotte, and inform ourselves, better understand the ecosystem of Black-led organizations in Charlotte, including groups like the Divine Nine, groups that traditionally are part of the philanthropic or nonprofit community, and others that aren't traditionally thought about, but are very important to Black communities. And so we spent really 2-3 years listening and educating ourselves, bringing in thought leaders from across the country in philanthropy, in social change, in racial equity and racial justice work. And we devised an initiative we call the BOLD Project, which is a framework that informs our circle's grant making, our civic engagement, our thought leadership here in Charlotte. And it's also a call to action for our entire community. And the BOLD Project is an initiative to strengthen Black-led organizations to lead differently. It was something we observed in our community, that our Black organizations, because of some of the chronic underfunding from the philanthropic realm, aren't as strong as they can be to be advocates for social change and racial justice in Charlotte. And so we wanted to bring attention to those organizations, first, to map these organizations that operate and are significant in our community, and to focus on 4 main things. One, around funding, and to advocate funding equity so that they can be advocates around civic engagement, around policy, and around community change. To support them around leadership, so investing in individuals, to be able to advance ideas and to help shape and drive and define the agenda here in Charlotte. It's around narratives, so the stories we tell. I mentioned we paid for that workshop, the op-ed project, to help people tell their stories better and to be influential. So it's about changing the stories we tell ourselves about our communities, and to provide opportunity for more authentic voices from our Black community. And then finally, it's around network. So just strengthening the network of Black-led organizations in Charlotte, our connections to Black people in Charlotte, to have greater power and to liberate ourselves, which is at the core of Black philanthropy.
Thank you, Valeta. And so at this point, I would love to be able to offer the opportunity to each of you to share a final word with us. We could have gone on in so many different directions and leveraging the significant expertise on this panel. And I first want to say thank you to all 3 of you for giving of your time and talent this evening, indeed your philanthropy, if you will, to this important community conversation. And what I would love for you to think about as you sort of prepare a last word is, and I've asked this a number of times in different settings that I've had the opportunity to share, but as we think about the march to the next 40 days, or certainly the future of the Black community and the role of philanthropy, et cetera, what gives you hope? If each of you could just reflect on the thing that gives you hope, that allows you to continue to move forward with optimism, if you will, around the opportunities for the Black community going forward. What gives you hope?
I'll say this, even though it may not seem like it at the time, at the current moment, the obstacles that are behind us are bigger than the obstacles in front of us. And that if we're talking about trying to make it come from behind victory, there was a much bigger point deficit in 1840 and 1820, where people had the idea that they could kill the institution of slavery. Or when people had the idea that they could survive Jim Crow and make a way for their families. Or when Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall, from our Howard people, were huddled in the basement of Founders Library, plotting out the plan that would ultimately culminate in Brown versus the Board of Education, and that victory, where they were at this HBCU with not very many resources. They had pens, paper, and a library, and they put it to use and defeated the institution of segregation at the highest court in the land. We've done more with less than we have now. And we have to keep that in mind, even amid the difficulties that confront us at this particular moment.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Good night, everybody.
Good night. Valeta.
Yes. I'm encouraged and hopeful about the love that exists in our community. When I think of the title of tonight's event about Black Philanthropy in Action, because of the way I define philanthropy, I read it as love in action. And I think about the Cornel West quote about you can't lead a people if you don't love a people, and you can't save the people if you don't serve the people. And I think that's seeing examples of that in the Black community gives me hope. Circles like your circle, like my circles, and the growing number of Black giving circles across the country give me hope that more of us recognize that philanthropy is deeper than your pockets, and that we can bring our traditions and our values around time, talent, treasure, and testimony. The fourth T I like to add, which is the power of our stories and our giving voice and our speaking truth to power to change things and change the future and influence and shape what the next generation will experience in America. That gives me hope.
Thank you so much. Leah.
So, one of the people that I really love to look to and whose words I want to look to right now is Ella Baker. And Ella Baker is an organizer, a field organizer for the NAACP, later for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. And one of the things that she says about equality and justice is that we have to invest in this idea of spade work, right? Tilling the soil, growing the ground, growing our gardens, and that it takes a full-time investment. So we have to look at this moment, I think, in terms of spade work and the kind of work that we have to do and that we have to commit to. This isn't just a moment, it's a movement that we have to commit to. And so when I think about that, I think that I'm hopeful because we have no shortage of talent. We have no shortage of energy. We have no shortage of ideas and kind of ideas blossoming out of our community. And then finally, the thing that should give us all hope is that in a moment that was a travesty, right? An American travesty, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, a moment where we didn't even have time to mourn. 26 million people across the globe came together and said Black Lives Matter, right? Energy in that, and there's possibility in that. It may be fragile possibility, but it's there. So it's only up to us, right? All we have to do is act on it. And the potential to do that is really there, and we should all be hopeful about that.
Thank you so much, Leah. And thank all three of you. Jelani, we know had to depart, and we're running a few minutes over time, but I think that it was time well spent as we not only experienced history, we heard stories, and we were given hope, given some direction as to those things that we each individually can do as we move forward, and certainly will continue to be accountable as the Black Giving Circle, the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, and all of us who are gathered here tonight to begin this move towards action. So with that, I would thank you.
Can I say one thing? I just also want to say a really big thank you to Joelle for moderating and doing such an excellent job moderating, and also to Francine Austin and Francine Entertainment and Marketing for producing and putting on this event. It's just exceptional. If we could do a round of applause, that would be great. Air virtual applause. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you all. And so with that, I will turn the floor over to Chris Cloud, who is the other co-chair of the Black Giving Circle, to close us out. Please remember, in the chat, there is information about how to give. You can text to give to the Black Giving Circle. I always remind myself 365, that's an easy number to remember, but you can always give more. Chris, take it away.
Joelle, thank you so much. You always do such a wonderful job, and we appreciate you being and leading this conversation for us this evening. First, I want to thank Jelani, Leah, and Velada for just a wonderfully thought-provoking and informative discussion. This is the second of two that we had planned for our 5th year celebration of the Black Giving Circle here in Hartford, and we couldn't be more pleased with the words that they brought to us tonight and the message that they left us with. So I'm going to be very brief because I know people need to get on to other things. Thank them for their time this evening. My message really is to say that I hope that you will consider supporting the Black Giving Circle going forward. There are 3 ways in which you can do that. You've seen it scrolling along the side. It's coming up on the screen now that you can join the foundation by texting, or you can visit Hartford Foundation for Public Giving.org, Black Giving Circle. You can be a resource in that you can volunteer as part of the Black Giving Circle. And third, you can always spread the word, which we really encourage people to do. If you don't feel like becoming a full member, you can also make a donation within your means to this great effort. So I want to thank Francine Austin for her great work in pulling this together. I want to thank our leader at the Hartford Foundation, Jay Williams, for all the effort that he has given and support throughout the years for this. I want to thank my co-chair, Brenda Delgado, and I also want to thank, finally, Shari Anderson, for without her effort, this never would have come. This started as a lunch conversation with she and I 2 years ago, and it was going to be a big event and dinner and so on and so forth, but of course, COVID hit, and this is what we ended up with. And in some ways, I think this was much better than, having a celebration in a public venue. So I want to thank everybody for their attention, their support tonight. We had close to 200 and some odd people who registered to be a part of this. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. I hope you all did too. And we hope that you will consider supporting us, and we'll look to see you all soon. Thank you so much and have a great evening.